1.1 1.
Demand for new cars is falling, and as a result,
2.
Even though we'd only just met.
3.
The picnic was cancelled at the last minute because of...
4.
She didn't tell him what she really thought of his new suit so as not to...
5.
Despite not getting very good reviews, the film...
6.
The accused is only 12 years old, and therefore he...
7.
The flight is delayed until 14:25 due to...
8.
I want to find a job nearer home so that I don't.
1.2 1.
demand for new cars is falling, and as a result, many workers have lost their jobs.
2.
Even though we'd only just met, we felt as if we'd known each other for ages.
3.
The picnic was cancelled at the last minute because of the terrible storm.
4.
She didn't tell him what she really thought of his new suit so as not to hurt his feelings.
5.
Despite not getting very good reviews, the film was a huge commercial success.
6.
The accused is only 12 years old, and therefore he cannot be named.
7.
The flight is delayed until 14:25 due to technical problems.
8.
I want to find a job nearer home so that I don't have to spend so much time commuting.
1.3
Welcome to Workplace, and in today's programme we're looking at the results of two recently published surveys, which both deal with the same topic, happiness at work. John, tell us about the first survey.
Well, this was done by a human resources consultancy who interviewed more than 1,000 workers and established a top 10 of the factors which make people happy at work. The most important factor for the majority of the people interviewed was having friendly, supportive colleagues. In fact, 73% of people interviewed put their relationship with colleagues as being the key factor contributing to happiness at work, which is a very high percentage. The second most important factor was having work that is enjoyable per se, that is, people actually liking what they do. The two least important factors were having your achievements recognised and, rather surprisingly, earning a competitive salary.
So we're not mainly motivated by money.
Apparently not.
Any other interesting information in the survey?
Yes. For example, 25% of the working people interviewed described themselves as very happy at work. However, 20% of employees described themselves as being unhappy.
That's quite a lot of unhappy people at work every day.
It is, isn't it? And there were several more interesting conclusions revealed by the survey. First of all, small is beautiful. People definitely prefer working for smaller organisations or companies with less than 100 staff. We also find out that, generally speaking, women were happier in their work than men.
Yes, we're a miserable bunch, aren't we?
And workers on part-time contracts who only work 4 or 5 hours a day are happier than those who work full-time. The researchers concluded that this is probably due to a better work-life balance.
Are bosses happier than their employees?
Yes, perhaps not surprisingly, the higher people go in a company, the happier they are. So senior managers enjoy their jobs more than people working under them.
Does the period of time you spend with the same company affect how happy you are?
Well, according to the survey, happiness declines the longer people stay with the same company or organisation. The most contented people were those who'd been with a company for less than 2 years, and the least contented were those who'd been in the same place of work for more than 10 years.
So you can stay too long in the same place?
So it seems. And lastly, according to the survey, apparently the happiest workers of all are those who are 55 years old or older, probably because they feel they're working at the peak of their powers.
Presumably, though, they haven't spent more than 10 years in the same job.
Exactly. So, how long have you been here then, Michael?
8 years. Maybe I should start thinking about looking for a new job.
Oh, heaven forbid.
1.4.
The second survey we're looking at in today's programme is the Sunday Times survey, which was all about the best UK companies to work for. Apparently, one of the best small companies to work for is Innocent Drinks. Well, I have with me in the studio Becca Walton, who works for Innocent Drinks. Becca, tell us what made you apply for the job at Innocent.
Well, I've always really liked them as a company. I'd always followed their website and their weekly newsletter. I'd always thought that they would be people that I would like to work for, so it was a case of just keeping my eyes on the job page and waiting for something that I thought I could do to come along.
In a recent survey about what makes people happy at work, Innocent was listed as one of the top companies to work for. You obviously think it is a happy company. Now, why do you think that?
Well, I can see how he would have scored quite highly on that scale. I think there's quite a big emphasis on a team environment at work. We're all mixed up, so nobody sits according to the group of people that they work with, which means that you get to make friends in different areas of the business. Everybody's aware of the projects that people are working on, the pressures that they're under, so it makes for a really good team environment.
1.5. 1.
Obviously, we have people on short-term contracts.
2.
A thing that does come up when we survey people is perhaps the work-life balance.
1.6. 1.
I managed to get a challenging and motivating job.
2.
I don't have any qualifications or experience.
3.
There's no job security, and I might be made redundant.
4.
I've had a very rewarding career in publishing.
5.
The job has a competitive salary and excellent benefits.
6.
It's a stimulating working environment with good opportunities and prospects.
7.
The employees don't enjoy the work as it's very monotonous.
8.
After she retired, she did voluntary work at her local hospital.
1.7. 1.
Ever since I was a child, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I love history. I love reading historical books. I love going to museums and looking at artifacts and reading where they came from and, when they date back to. And it's just something I've always wanted to do. The idea of travelling around the world, going to visiting faraway places and doing excavating and stuff has always fascinated me. A friend of my father-in-law's, in fact, is an archaeologist, and the tales she tells are quite extraordinary. I think she's she's somewhere very exotic right now, and I'm always very envious when I speak to her.
2.
The thing I'd hate to do is to be a hairdresser. I can think of absolutely nothing worse than having to stand up all day, touching people's hair, and dealing with complaints. I think that would be my idea of absolute hell. I do know 2 people who are hairdressers, actually, and each one of them have had horror stories where they've completely destroyed somebody's hair. A friend of mine left a perm in someone's hair too long once and all the hair burnt off and it went orange. What can you do? I mean, that's just horrendous. And the other person just completely messed up a haircut, and the woman had complete hysterics in the shop and was really tearful, and so I just think it would be terrifying.
1.8. Song. The logical song.
When I was young, it seemed that life was so wonderful, a miracle. Oh, it was beautiful, magical.
1.9.
In the spring of 1800, the court painter Francisco de Goya was commissioned by the Spanish King Carlos IV, direct ancestor of King Juan Carlos, to paint a portrait of the royal family. At the time, the royal family were all staying at the summer palace of Aranjuez, near Madrid. First on the left is Prince Carlos, the king's second son, and next to him is his older brother, Prince Fernando, who was the heir to the throne. Fernando grew up hating his parents, especially his mother. But in fact, he took after his mother in that he was very vain and authoritarian, and when he eventually became king, he was extremely unpopular. The old woman just behind Prince Fernando is Maria Josefa, the king's sister. Single and childless, she died shortly after the painting was finished. Next to Maria Josefa is a young woman whose face we cannot see because she is looking away, and she is the mystery person in this painting. There are two theories about her identity. One theory is that she is Princess Maria Amalia, one of the king's daughters, who died in childbirth 3 years before the picture was painted. The fact that she's looking away would be to show that she was in fact dead. However, the other more popular theory is that she represents the woman that Crown Prince Fernando would one day marry. It would have been important to put her in the picture to show that the prince would marry one day and have a son to carry on the dynasty. If this theory is true, the woman would be looking away because she didn't actually exist at that time. In fact, Fernando did marry, not once, but 4 times. The young girl, next to the mystery woman, is Princess Maria Isabel, the king's youngest daughter. She went on to marry her cousin and had 12 children. Next to her is the Queen, Maria Luisa. Goya made her the central figure in the painting because she had a very strong personality, and she completely dominated her husband, the king. As a young woman, she had been very beautiful and was rumoured to have had numerous lovers. In middle age, as she is here, she was still very vain. She'd tried to compensate for the fact that her beauty was fading by wearing exquisite dresses and jewellery, as we can see in the picture. The little boy with the Queen is her youngest son, Prince Francisco. He was a very sensitive boy, and he suffered all his life due to the fact that he looked incredibly like one of his mother's lovers. As a result, people assumed that he was not in fact the king's son. The king, who is standing next to him, was a weak man. Although he came to the throne full of ideas and dreams, his wife and his advisers made sure that he never managed to achieve any of them, and he died frustrated and disappointed. The king's brother is standing behind him, and on his right, although you can only actually see part of her head, is the king's eldest daughter, Carlota. Her parents arranged a marriage for her when she was only 10 years old. She was an ambitious girl and eventually became Queen of Portugal. The final group of 3 figures shows the Queen's brother, Don Luis de Parma, his wife, Maria Luisa, and their first child, a baby boy. In fact, Maria Luisa was not only Don Luis's wife, she was also his niece, as she was the king's second daughter. In fact, Don Luis was supposed to have married the king's eldest daughter, Carlota, but he fell in love with Princess Maria Luisa, who was lively and intelligent, and he insisted on marrying her. The royal family didn't all pose together for the painting. It would have taken too long. Instead, Goya made individual studies of each family member and later used them to create this work. The painting took him 2 years to complete, and it was the last royal portrait he ever painted. Incidentally, he included himself in the painting. He is standing in the background, on the left, behind the two princes. Carlos IV called this painting the Family Altogether picture, and it was originally hung in the Royal Palace in Madrid.
1.10. 1,
I quite agree.
2,
I totally agree.
3,
That's what I think too.
4,
Absolutely.
5,
I take your point, but
6,
I see what you mean, but
7,
I agree up to a point, but
8,
I completely disagree.
9,
I don't agree at all.
1.11. 1,
I'd say that
2,
if you ask me,
3,
Personally, I think that
4,
personally speaking,
5,
in my opinion,
6,
In my view,
7,
I feel that
8,
my feeling is that
9.
as far as I'm concerned,
1.12.
Do you find it easier to understand native or non-native speakers of English?
Well, it all depends where they come from. I suppose it's more or less the same. Some non-natives are more difficult than others if you're not used to the accent. For instance, I used to find some Japanese and Chinese speakers difficult to understand. But then, because of work, I went to the Far East lots of times, and then it became okay. Natives, again, it all depends. I was taught RP, and one assumes that everybody speaks that. And of course, I had friends from lots of parts of Britain who did not speak RP. In fact, it is a pretty rare thing these days. So we have a good friend from Glasgow, and it was always embarrassing for me because I could not understand most of what he was saying. I still don't.
How do you feel about having your English corrected?
I don't mind. My children used to love correcting me. They still say I speak very funny English, but usually adults in this country do not correct you. I would like to be corrected.
Do you find it easier to understand native or non-native speakers of English?
It depends what you mean. As far as pronunciation goes, it's a lot easier to understand native speakers with a standard accent like BBC English or General American. And for me, some of the regional dialects are quite easy to understand as well. Other dialects are a lot harder to decipher, like Scots or Geordie or New Zealand are really hard to understand. As far as content is concerned, it's a lot easier to understand non-native speakers because they don't use idiomatic expressions or obscure cultural references. They don't use regional slang. They also use the Latin verb instead of a phrasal verb, for example, like continue rather than carry on, which is less easy to confuse. And the other thing about non-native speakers is that they are a lot more direct. When they speak in English, they say what they mean. There are no allusions and metaphors and references to other things.
How do you feel about having your English corrected?
I don't mind. I'm sometimes annoyed with myself for making a recurring mistake again, like mixing up he and she. And I find it a bit weird when a non-native speaker who's less fluent than me corrects my English. And I also think that non-native speakers, good non-native speakers, are often better at spelling than native speakers, because we learn words with their spelling, whereas native speakers learn the word first and learn the spelling years later. And just recently, an English friend of mine corrected my spelling of accommodation, which I spelt with double C and double M, and he insisted that it was spelt with a single M. In fact, I was right.
1.13.
Do you have any funny or embarrassing stories related to misunderstanding someone?
Yes, misunderstanding and being misunderstood. Several. Some I don't think I would like to tell you about, but I'll tell you one. I was a student at the University of Michigan in the United States, and my phonetics professor was very handsome, and therefore I did extremely well. Not in all subjects, but it was worth studying that one. But I remember my first tutorial when he said, "See you later." And I thought, interesting, where? And in class I'd asked a question and he'd said, "Interesting question." So I thought, great, he thinks I'm clever and maybe he thinks I'm interesting to meet somewhere else. But I couldn't understand how I was going to find out where or when. I luckily didn't ask. It would have been very embarrassing.
Is there anything you still find difficult about English?
Yes, I think that there are things that have especially to do with cultural aspects. I used to find when my children were little that I didn't know the same nursery rhymes that you know here. I didn't know the actions. And I still don't know lots of things. I don't know, to give you an example, say I had learned American English, but I still didn't know who the Simpsons were.
Do you have any funny or embarrassing stories related to misunderstanding someone?
Hungarians aren't generally interested in bird watching, and most Hungarians I know can't tell one bird from another. And recently a friend of mine told me about seeing some kites over the fields near their house the previous weekend. And I said that flying kites is really popular in Budapest too, meaning that people go into the hills at the weekend to fly their homemade paper kites. It never occurred to me for a second that she may be talking about a bird. I don't think a Hungarian would ever tell someone else about seeing some birds several days before.
Is there anything you still find difficult about English?
Not really. I've been learning English for 26 years. If I had to say anything, I would say counting numbers. If I have to count anything, I have to switch back to Hungarian, even if the person I'm speaking to will need the English sum.
1.14. 1.
Hurt. Air. Adhere. Hardly. Himself.
2.
Throw. Elbow. Lower. Power. Grow.
3.
Alike. Despite. River. Transcribe. Quite.
4.
Whenever. Why. Whose. Where. Which.
5.
Jealous. Journalist. Reject. Job. Enjoy.
6.
Change. Achieve. Machine. Catch. Charge.
7.
Salary. Satisfying. Spontaneous. Synonym. Sure.
8.
Awful. Sore. Floor. Drawback. Law.
9.
Short. Corner. Work. Ignore. Reporter.
10.
Firm. Dirty. Third. T-shirt. Require.
1.15. Part 1.
Why did you start researching your family history?
Well, it was mainly, I think, because in 1995 we were given a present by friends of ours of a computer program that was a family tree program. And we'd been talking about it from time to time, but this was the incentive, if you will, to start typing in what we knew. And then we realised how much we didn't know. So that's where we started.
When you start researching, what's the first step? The first thing you do?
Well, the first thing you do is to ask living people about what they know, but that can be very dangerous because family myths grow up and you can often find that what you're told isn't accurate. So then you start with birth certificates and marriage certificates, and you keep going back because the marriage certificate will give you the name of the parent of the bride, the parent of the bridegroom. And then you go back to birth certificates, so you work back using those two.
In practical terms, what difference has the internet made to researching family history?
Oh, it's made an absolutely massive difference. There is no comparison. In the days before the internet, it involved going to London initially, to two different places, one to look at births, marriages and deaths, and the other, a completely different building, to look at census records. And then, of course, once you got back as far as you could, then it involved travelling perhaps around the country to visit a church to get parish records, which was fun, but also vastly time-consuming. It's so much simpler now.
How far could most people expect to be able to trace back their families?
It's fairly easy to get back to 1837, when the birth, marriage and death registers were compiled and started. Most people can get back there. With a little bit more work involving parish registers, you can usually get back to the late 1700s, and it gets progressively more difficult after that. It's easier if you have an unusual name, and it's easier if they come from a small village as opposed to London.
How far back have you managed to trace your family?
Well, one particular branch, thanks to the very helpful material from a lady in Oxfordshire, I've got back to 1490. But this is only because that particular branch was somewhat better off than the others, so there were wills left and records of business deals and things like that. But that's an awful lot of hard work, and this lady must have spent years and years researching it and very generously shares it with me and other people.
1.16 Part 2.
Was there anything in particular that you hoped to find out when you began researching?
Yes, I really didn't know anything about beyond my grandparents because it wasn't something that was ever discussed in the family. So I was curious to find out where they came from, things like that.
Have you found out anything surprising? Any skeleton in the cupboard?
Yes, indeed. In fact, it was this year. When the 1911 census was released, it was released 2 years early, I discovered that instead of just having two aunts and my father, there were another 7 children, which I had no knowledge of at all, including triplets who were 1 month old. And they were never spoken about, and there's no way of finding out what happened to them or where they went.
And how did you feel when you found this out?
I think it made me angry, to be honest, because my father had never ever mentioned anything like that. And they were a lot of kids. There were triplets, there were 2 more brothers, and it may just have been as though they hadn't lived at all, because there was no mention ever in the family about it. And frustratingly, of course, there's absolutely no way I can find out. So that's a shame.
Why is there no way you can find this out?
Well, there's no record of their birth, there's no record of their death. If they were given away, which I don't think is impossible because they were a poor family, then the surname would have changed. And there would have been no record of that. And there's no living relative that I can talk to.
So have you just given up?
You hate to give up on it, and then you rack your brains and think, is there any way I could find out? And, of course, the only possibility with the Shepherd family I mentioned in the 1911 census is when the next one comes out in another 10 years, there might be some possibility of seeing if they were around somewhere then, but that's a long way away.
Did you find out anything else surprising?
I did, in fact, find some births that were quite close to the marriage date, and that was a little unexpected. But my secret wish, I suppose, was to hope that Dick Shepherd, the highwayman, might have been somewhere in the family tree. But if he is, I haven't got that far back. But I wouldn't mind at all. It'd be quite exciting to have that sort of ancestor, I think.
Do you think that research into family histories is addictive?
Oh, yes. Yes, I think any hobby can become so. But this is a fascinating hobby. Perhaps fortunately, both my wife and I worked then and we're still working, so time available is dictated by work schedules. But yes, it can be. It's a fascinating hobby.
1.17. 1.
Which was fun, but also vastly time-consuming.
2.
You can usually get back to the late 1700s.
3.
There's absolutely no way I can find out. So, that's a shame.
4.
You hate to give up on it, and then you rack your brains and think, is there any way I could find out?
5.
There might be some possibility of seeing if they were around somewhere then, but that's a long way away.
6.
But if he is, I haven't got that far back.
1.18. 1.
Sheila. How much do you know about your family tree?
Not a great deal, actually.
Have you ever researched it?
I haven't, but my cousin has. And she's looked into the family history of my mother's side of the family. And it'd be really interesting to find out what she's learned, really.
Is there someone in your family that you'd like to know more about?
Both my grandfathers. So my grandfather on my mother's side, he was a musician, professional musician, and travelled a lot during the war. And I think he made quite a lot of money because I've got lots of photographs of him with racing cars and motorbikes. I think he was a bit of a boy racer, so it'd be quite interesting to find out more about him. And my other grandfather on my father's side, I think he was a code breaker in the war, so he's got a bit of a secretive side that would be interesting to research.
2.
Naomi. How much do you know about your family tree?
I have to admit that I personally don't know all that much about my own family tree, really. A little bit. I probably can go back a couple of generations, maybe.
Have you ever researched it?
I haven't researched it personally, but my dad has. He's done some research on it, and I think my grandmother on my mother's side also did some research a while back.
Is there someone in your family that you'd like to know more about?
Yeah, probably my dad's mother. She was a single mum, basically, and she raised my dad on her own, and I think if she were alive now, I'd probably like to ask her a few more questions about what that was like and how she felt and what it was like growing up as well, because I think it would have been different for her.
3.
Tim.
How much do you know about your family tree?
I wouldn't say I know too much extensively about my family tree. I know I'm Polish and French Indian, but I only know up to my grandparents. I've never really researched into the history of my family or my family tree that much.
Is there someone in your family that you'd like to know more about?
Probably my grandfather on my father's side. He died when I was pretty young, and I know he had a lot of hobbies that I'd be interested in, but I didn't really get a chance to spend a lot of time with him.
4.
Jeremy.
How much do you know about your family tree?
I know a little bit about my family tree. We've done some research on my mother's side, less on my father's side, which is a bit of a mystery. My grandfather, in fact, he wrote his sort of memoirs of his childhood and his parents and grandparents, which I've kind of helped my mum type up. So I know about them. He was a chauffeur. His father worked as, I think, a footman in some country house. And his grandfather was, I think, something, I don't know what he did, but something like that, yeah.
Are there any other people in your family you'd like to know more about?
I'd like to know more about my father's side because I take after my dad. Everyone says I look like him. And I don't really know much about his parents or his grandparents, so that would be interesting to find out about them.
1.19. 1,
Not a great deal, actually.
2,
Probably my grandfather on my father's side. He died when I was pretty young.
3,
I think my grandmother on my mother's side also did some research a while back.
4,
We've done some research on my mother's side, less on my father's side, which is a bit of a mystery.